Every night, the cafe stayed open 15 minutes longer than it needed to. Not 10, not 20, exactly 15. The sign on the door clearly said closing time, 11:45 p.m. But anyone who lived on that quiet street long enough knew the truth. The lights inside the cafe stayed warm until midnight. The chairs were not stacked until then. The lock did not turn until then. And every night, just before midnight, the owner looked at the door as if expecting it to open. The street noticed. Streets notice more than people think. They remember footsteps, habits, pauses, the places where someone once stopped and never quite stopped stopping. And on this street, narrow, old, and lined with shop windows that reflected more darkness than light after sunset, the small cafe with the faded lantern sign had become part of the night's memory. Its name was Late Lantern Café. During the day, it was ordinary enough. People came in for coffee, sandwiches, the soup of the day if the weather was poor enough to justify it. Office workers sat by the windows with hurried lunches. Students bent over notebooks. Travelers pulled rolling suitcases across the tile floor and asked if there was a charging outlet near the back table. But at night, the cafe changed. Or perhaps it simply became more honest. The noise thinned, the tables emptied. The city outside softened into distant traffic and the occasional passing footsteps. The lamps above the counter cast warm pools of amber light over the wood. Cups cooled slowly. The air held the smell of coffee grounds, sugar, dish soap, and old rain caught in people's coats. It was then that the cafe felt less like a business and more like a place built for unfinished thoughts. And Samuel, the owner, seemed to belong most to that hour. Samuel was 63, though most people guessed younger until they noticed the silver at his temples and the kind of tired patience that only time gives a person. He moved carefully, never in a hurry, as if rushing would insult the quiet. He wore the same dark apron every night, always neatly tied, and kept a folded dish towel over one shoulder, even when he wasn't using it. He was not unfriendly, but he had the manner of someone who had learned that gentleness did not require explanation. He remembered what regular customers drank. He refilled cups without interrupting conversations. He let people sit longer than they needed to, especially if they were alone. On winter nights, he sometimes slid a small candle onto empty tables just to make the room feel less hollow. No one knew much about him beyond the practical things. He had owned the cafe for 19 years. He never took vacations. He made excellent coffee and better soup. And every night, without fail, he kept the door unlocked until midnight. People asked him about it now and then. "Why not just change the sign?" a delivery driver once said. "If you're open until 12, say 12. Samuel had smiled while polishing a glass. "Because we close at 11:45, he said. The driver frowned. "Then why are the lights still on?" Samuel folded the towel once, neatly. "Because I wait a little after closing." "For what?" Samuel glanced at the door. "For someone who might be late." The driver laughed, assuming it was a joke. It was not. Years earlier, before the silver in his hair, before the cafe had become part of the neighborhood's emotional furniture, Samuel had not meant to own a cafe at all. He had worked in publishing then. Quiet work, predictable work, the sort of work that lets a person disappear respectably behind paper and deadlines. He had liked the rhythm of it. He had liked how words could be arranged until they behaved. Back then, he came to the street only because of her. Her name was Eleanor. She had a way of entering a room that made it feel as though something gentle had arrived, rather than someone important. She taught literature at a school 3 blocks away and believed, with the serious conviction of kind people, that stories could save parts of a life nothing else could reach. They met in a bookstore at the far end of the same street, both reaching for the same worn copy of a novel neither of them truly needed. Eleanor smiled first. "You can take it," she said. Samuel, who had always been too formal with strangers, shook his head. "You saw it first." "I saw it," she said, "but you look like you came here for it." He nearly said no. Instead, he said, "Would it be absurd if I asked you to have coffee with me instead?" "It would depend," she said, "on the coffee." So they crossed the street to the cafe that had occupied the corner long before it belonged to Samuel, and sat by the window while rain touched the glass in quiet patterns. The coffee was not exceptional. The conversation was. They returned the next week, and the week after that. Then almost every Thursday, then on Tuesdays as well, then on whatever evenings felt too long to spend separately. It became their place without either of them announcing it. Some people fall in love through grand declarations. They fell in love through repetition. A corner table, 2 cups, a shared dessert they always claimed they wouldn't order. The staff began bringing Eleanor extra sugar without asking. Samuel learned that she stirred her tea exactly 3 times, and never more. She learned that when he was troubled, he straightened the cutlery, even if it was already straight. Years passed. The bookstore closed. The florist beside it became a pharmacy. The old cafe went up for sale. Eleanor was the one who said it first. "You should buy it?" Samuel laughed. "With what? My hidden empire?" "No," she said, smiling into her cup. "With your sadness." He looked at her over the rim of his coffee. "That is not a recognized currency." "It should be. You'd be wealthy." Then she grew quieter. "You notice people when they're trying not to be noticed," she said. "That's what a cafe needs at night. Not efficiency, attention." He did not answer immediately. He looked around the room, at the scratched wooden tables, at the tired lamps, at the small condensation rings left by forgotten glasses. And because she had spoken for the first time, like the future was a room they might both enter, he allowed himself to imagine it. A year later, improbably and against most practical advice, he bought the cafe. They painted the walls themselves, burned one batch of pastries so badly on the opening week that the smell lingered for days, chose mismatched cups from secondhand shops because Eleanor said perfect sets made people nervous. They named it Late Lantern Cafe because Eleanor liked the sound of it. "It makes it seem," she said, hanging the little sign in the window, "as though the place exists for people who haven't found home yet." Samuel kissed her forehead and said, "That is either very poetic or very bad branding. It can be both." With Eleanor, many things were. For years, the cafe was theirs in all the ways that mattered. She took the evening shift twice a week after school and read at the counter when it was quiet. Sometimes she left brief notes for him between the pages of the order book. "Buy more cinnamon." The student at table 3 is pretending to study, but is actually in love. "Don't forget to eat something that is not toast." They were not dramatic people. They did not need to be. Their life together was built from small acts repeated faithfully. Unlocking the door each morning, counting coins at closing, walking home beneath the streetlights when the street had emptied and the cafe windows reflected only themselves. Then came the winter evening that changed the shape of time. It was raining lightly, not enough to keep customers away, but enough to make the windows blur. Eleanor arrived late, carrying a damp scarf and the familiar tiredness of end-of-term exhaustion. She set her bag behind the counter, smiled at Samuel, and said, "I'll just sit for 5 minutes before I become useful." He poured her tea without asking. She wrapped both hands around the cup and sat at their corner table by the window. The cafe was nearly empty. One student in the back, a couple paying the bill, the radio playing too softly to matter. Samuel was wiping down the counter when the phone rang. He answered, listened, and watched the color leave Eleanor's face before he had even turned fully toward her. It was the hospital. Her sister had been admitted unexpectedly 2 towns over. Nothing had been explained clearly, only that Eleanor should come as soon as possible. Samuel said, "I'll come with you." But Eleanor was already standing, pulling on her coat with shaking hands. "No, stay, close up. I'll call from the train. I can lock the door right now." She came to him then, placed one cold hand against his cheek, and tried to smile in the brave way people do when they do not yet know how frightened they are. "It's all right," she said. "I'll be back before you close one night and complain that you've overwatered the soup again." "I don't overwater the soup." "You absolutely do." He nearly laughed. She kissed him once, quickly, because leaving always feels easier if you pretend you are coming right back. Then she took her bag and left. Samuel watched her run through the rain toward the station at the end of the street. He expected her call. It did not come that night, or the next. There were messages later, scattered, exhausted, brief. Her sister had worsened, then stabilized, then worsened again. Days blurred into hospital corridors and uncertainty. Samuel offered to come, but Eleanor kept saying not yet, not tonight, soon. Then, in the space of a week, everything changed too quickly and too strangely to belong to ordinary life. Her sister died. Eleanor stayed away longer than expected, helping sort things, close apartments, sign papers no grieving person should have to sign. When she finally returned to the city, she came back altered. Not broken, but shifted, as if grief had quietly moved the furniture inside her. She still sat at the corner table, still smiled, still tucked notes into the order book. But sometimes, while drying cups, she would go still for several seconds, as if listening to something far away. Sometimes she stared at the door when no one was there. Samuel loved her the way he always had, which is to say, attentively, imperfectly, without understanding soon enough that love does not always know how to hold grief when grief changes its language. One night, months later, she stood by the counter after closing and said, "I don't think I know how to come back fully." He looked up from the register. "What do you mean?" She searched for the words and failed in the visible way that hurt more than tears. "I mean, I'm here," she said, pressing one hand lightly against the counter. "But part of me is still somewhere else, with her, with the person I was before, with whatever I was supposed to do differently." Samuel stepped around the counter. "You don't have to do this alone." She smiled, but it was the kind of smile that thanks you for offering what it cannot yet accept. "I know." They closed the cafe together that night, walked home side by side. spoke about practical things because practical things are easier to carry. A week later, Eleanor left a note on the kitchen table. Not a goodbye. Not exactly. Just a sentence, carefully written. I need some time where nothing expects me to return to normal. Samuel read it twice, then a third time, as if repetition might reveal an address hidden between the words. She went to the coast, a friend told him. Then north for a teaching program. Then somewhere else. Their messages became less frequent, then rare, then impossible to interpret. There was no betrayal, no final argument. Only distance, grief, and the slow erosion of shared direction. The last message he received from her said, I still think of the cafe at closing. Some places keep a light on inside you, even when you're far away. After that, silence. At first, Samuel closed at 11:45 because that was the posted time. Then one night, standing with his hand on the lock, he thought of Eleanor running through the rain saying, I'll be back before you close one night. He looked at the street. It was 11:46. So he waited. Only for a few minutes, he told himself. Just in case. No one came. The next night, he did it again. And the next. Eventually, the waiting became part of the architecture of the place, as fixed as the lamps and the chalkboard menu. He cleaned the tables, counted the till, rinsed the cups, and then he stood by the counter and looked at the door until midnight. He told no one the full reason. People are often kinder with mysteries than with explanations. Years passed. The neighborhood changed. Customers came and went. Some noticed the 15 extra minutes and made private legends about it. Samuel let them. Only once did he come close to telling the truth. A woman in her 20s had stayed late one snowy evening, long after her laptop had died and her untouched tea had gone cold. She looked like someone trying not to fall apart in a public place. At 11:50, she stood, embarrassed. I'm sorry, she said. I didn't realize how late it was. Samuel glanced at the clock. It's all right. We're still open. She hesitated. Your sign says... Yes, he said gently. The sign says many things. That made her smile for the first time all evening. Before leaving, she asked, Why do you stay open? Samuel looked at the door, at the dark street beyond it, at the place where rain had once blurred the glass around Eleanor's departing figure. For someone who said they might come back, he answered. The woman considered this without amusement. Do you think they will? Samuel folded the dish towel over his shoulder. No, he said honestly. But I think it matters that the light is on. She nodded slowly, as though she understood more than he had expected. I hope someone once did that for me, she said. Then she left. Samuel kept the lamps on until midnight. Winter turned to spring, spring to summer, summer back to winter again. The cafe became known less for its coffee than for the strange feeling people had there late at night, that they had been allowed, briefly, to stop performing. Students cried there quietly after exam results. Divorced men stared into cooling cups and practiced new forms of silence. Women who had left something behind in another country sat by the window and watched the street as if translating their own lives. Samuel never asked too many questions. He had learned that most people, if given warmth and enough unguarded quiet, will eventually tell the truth to themselves without help. And always at 11:45, the official closing time arrived. And always the true closing time did not. Then one November evening, nearly 19 years after Eleanor had run into the rain, the bell above the door rang at 11:58 p.m. Samuel looked up automatically. The person who entered was a woman in a dark coat, carrying the cold with her. Her hair was streaked with silver now. Her face was thinner, calmer, older in all the ways he must have been older too. For one suspended second, neither of them moved. Then Eleanor said, with a softness that belonged more to memory than to speech, "You're still open." Samuel stood very still behind the counter. "Yes," he said. She looked around the cafe, the lamps, the counter, the corner table by the window. "You kept the chairs," she said. "The mismatched ones?" She smiled faintly. "You said they looked accidental." "They still do." There are reunions filled with tears and music and the grand theater of unresolved feeling. This was not one of them. This was quieter, more dangerous perhaps, because it allowed the full weight of time into the room. Samuel gestured toward the corner table. "You should sit." Eleanor removed her coat and sat where she always had. He brought her tea without asking what kind. Her hands closed around the cup as though remembering. For a while they said nothing. Then Eleanor looked at the clock. "Midnight," she said. "I'm late." Samuel almost smiled. "You always were, eventually." She lowered her gaze. "I wasn't sure you'd still be here." "I wasn't sure either," he said. "But the cafe was." That earned a quieter smile. Outside, the street held its breath around them. Inside, the lamps burned with the same amber patience they always had. "I should have written more," Eleanor said at last. Samuel did not rescue her from the sentence. "Yes," he said. She nodded, accepting it. "I kept thinking I needed to become someone clearer before I could come back. Less unfinished, less altered." She looked into her tea. "But grief doesn't return what it changes." "No," Samuel said. "I thought if I came back too soon, everything would ask to be what it was before." He leaned one hand against the back of the empty chair opposite her. "And now?" Eleanor looked around the room. "Now I think some places are kinder than that." The bell above the door did not ring again. No other customers came. The city moved on outside, indifferent and immense. They spoke for a long time, not to repair the lost years. Lost years are not repaired. They are acknowledged, sometimes grieved, and then carefully placed where they can stop cutting the hand that carries them. They spoke about Eleanor's sister, about the coast, about teaching in towns Samuel had never seen, about the cafe surviving rent increases and winters and loneliness, about how some people leave not because they love less, but because pain makes them incapable of standing where they were once known. At last, Eleanor asked, "Why 15 minutes?" Samuel looked at the clock again. Because he could have said, "Because that was the amount of time between you leaving and me understanding that you might not come back right away." Because he could have said, "Because grief is often measured in absurd rituals." Because he could have said, "Because hope, once given a schedule, becomes easier to survive." Instead, he said, "It felt long enough for someone running through the rain." Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, they were shining but steady. "I'm sorry," she said. "I know," he answered. Not forgiveness, not refusal, just truth. She reached into her bag and placed something on the table between them. An old key. Samuel frowned slightly. "The apartment above the bakery," she said. "I rented it last week." He looked at her, then at the key, then back at the woman time had altered, but not erased. Eleanor gave the smallest, most fragile smile. "I thought I might stay for a while," she said. if the cafe still needs help closing. Outside, the streetlights hummed softly over the empty road. Inside, the Late Lantern Cafe held the hour the way it had held so many others, with warmth, with patience, with room for unfinished things. Samuel sat down across from her. The clock moved past midnight. For the first time in years, he did not feel himself waiting for the door. He was already where he had hoped the light might lead. And somewhere in the quiet structure of the cafe, the worn tables, the old lamps, the window that had watched rain and return alike, something settled, not into the past, into the present, which, after all those years, was enough.